I'm Jo Holder from the Cross Art Projects. We're a small project space that is fortunate to be able to present ideas, public conversations, in a way that's often quite discursive. So we can present one part of an issue and how art interfaces or can add or define that issue. And then several years later we can return to that. Rather like writing a book, you get a chapter and often the chapters are in conversation with each other. This exhibition in a way started in 2007 with the exhibition at the old Cross Art Projects in Roslyn Street called Takia versus the King, which showcased Mulkan Wirrapanda, and Takia was her father. Interestingly, when you look, that exhibition coincided with the intervention, or the imposition of the intervention. It also coincided, oddly enough, with the granting of sea rights to the people in Blue Mud Bay, to the Yolngu people, of whom Mulkan Wirrapanda was one of the senior leader figures. So 5 years on, we returned to this chapter, not in the way we would like to, but we returned to this on the eve of the introduction of the legislation to the Senate to continue the intervention. So
the exhibition came about in a couple of ways as a response to what came to be called the intervention, the Northern Territory Emergency Response in 2007. And as you may have noticed in the press, as it's called, the public press, that it's very difficult to get certain views, other than the very prescribed views, of a select number of a gang of 4 Aboriginal speakers into the press. They can get the press for any event, any comment, and yet no one else can struggle to get into the press. As an art curator, I've always believed that art is a social act, and it's a personal act, but it's a social act, and it has to talk of things within the society that it comes from. And in that regard, I saw this exhibition and exhibitions like this, like the Cold Eels, etc., as a way to break that nexus of trying to get into the press in any way, shape or form. It came to be called Ghost Citizens because of a number of reasons. It's because, in effect, of how Aboriginal people have always been something like ghost citizens. And that was, so the title just came to me one day recently, in fact very late in the piece, and with the help of Jo, we then put together this number of artists who have done work or tried to bring the whole issue of the intervention, as it's come to be called, into the public domain. We never would believe that we would see such a thing as the intervention in our lifetime in this country.
Is that what the intervention's done is re-establish the Aboriginal Protection Board. Okay, and so you now have a network stretching right across the Northern Territory of these government business managers, or the new protectors, the new native welfare officers, that are existing. The local authority, as John mentions, have been dissolved. People have no local, mechanism that they can control their life. The laws are on top of them that will be continued under Stronger Futures, say essentially that you're a second-class citizen. So alcohol is banned on all Aboriginal land on threat of going to jail. If you have actually any quantity of alcohol on Aboriginal land, you can be taken to prison for that under this legislation. Pornography is of course banned. So the 2 groups of people in Australia who aren't able to access alcohol or pornography are children and Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory. There's explicit paternalism, can only be described as paternalism. Of course we support, if communities want to initiate, and many did, their own bans, their own thing, of course they need to be supported, but the racism of saying a whole group of people, a whole form of land tenure that belongs to one race of people, these are the laws that we're going to apply. We've actually now got 5% less kids, going to school. One of the main things was supposed to be, we're going to look after you and all this, so you get your kids to school. The disruption that's been caused by the Northern Territory intervention, the dissolution of the local authorities, the disbanding of the bilingual education programs that had built a whole Aboriginal workforce around a lot of schools in the Northern Territory. The disruption that's been caused by all these reforms actually means that we've got less kids in school now. Actually, more kids being submitted to hospital for malnutrition, more kids under 5 that are actually underweight, more kids under 5 that are actually wasting, because of the level of malnutrition that they've got. And as I said, these problems existed prior to the intervention, but the fact that these things haven't improved and they're spending all this money and putting all these control measures and in some cases are getting worse, I think is really serious cause for concern. A 70% increase in the rate of child removal in 5 years. 70%, right? The majority, again, of those cases of child removal are not for abuse, they're for neglect. They're for neglect. And what is neglect? It's poverty, extreme poverty, not being in a situation where you can actually look after a kid. That statistic of neglect it's not repeated anywhere else in Australia. It's not because Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory don't care about their kids more than anyone else in the country. It's that they physically do not have the actual means to provide for people. In so many cases, which is what's going on. So it's a very very acute crisis. That exists, that had always existed really, given that the years and years of marginalisation, the government refusing to actually invest properly in communities, give people access to the very basic things that we all take for granted in terms of having a roof over your head, having a hot tap that you can turn on. These things just don't exist for people, for so many people. There's no kitchen, there's no toilet, there's no sewage system, in many cases. And yet the amount of money that they have to spend on the prison system, on the police, on the income management system, on the government business managers, all these things, just absolutely criminal that this money is being spent on these control measures which are making people's lives worse when that need is there and that need is so desperate.
But what I find interesting is what I've labelled casual racism, which is the fact that because all of this started in the Northern Territory and because it happens to Aborigines, the response you very often get from people of goodwill, people I know, people I've sort of been part of other movements and things like that, and they say, well, you had to do something. And I said, yeah, but you didn't have to fuck them up even further. And they look at you with great surprise. There is a sense in the community that because it's happening to Aboriginal people, it must be that there's something wrong there. All this money gets spent, all of these efforts get spent and nothing changes. But people don't understand what the sort of basis of a lot of this is. So this casual racism is hidden, all of these changes, because people just switch off. They switch off because they can't deal with it, they don't know how to deal with it. We've got an extraordinarily conservative pair of governments and opposition in the social area. They are appalling on Aborigines, particularly in the Northern Territory. But, people, they'd actually picked up a group of African immigrants who said things like, how did we end up on income management? It must be because we're black. Because we know white people that are applying for exemptions, and they actually get the exemptions, and somehow or other we don't get the exemptions. What you're getting, and what I'm trying to sort of point out here, is, yes, you've got the residues of the appalling racism that's been around ever since we arrived in 1788. What you've got building on that at the moment is a set of other extraordinarily conservative views, which literally come out of the 19th century, which are punitive to anybody who's not part of the get-a-job mob. So the idea that everybody has to become an economically productive person is very deeply embedded in the whole Northern Territory intervention in what they're trying to do. It's embedded in how they're trying to get people to read, reading, writing and arithmetic, to get jobs in the mining industry, to be actually productive citizens. The only level of production that this government is actually prepared to wear is economic production. I've been going around, I'm trying to set up a thing if anybody here wants to be part of it, to say, can we start talking about social policy and not economic policy? We live in a society, not an economy. And I think that's something we've forgotten. That this is a culture that needs respect and needs to be recognised, that has much to contribute. In a time of much more limited resources, it would be good if we looked at how you could actually manage on far fewer resources without using up the world. It isn't working. It doesn't work. This government claims to be evidence-based, but it doesn't work, and they're making it worse. The sorts of things that Paddy was talking about, that sense of despair, the sense of lack of control, is a classic example of what happens to communities that have actually had removed from their own community committees, their own control, their own CDP, all of the things in which they have a say. I think we need to start getting some decent coalitions going together. We need to start talking about the sort of society we want, which has a strong Indigenous influence in it, because that would make it a better society. We've got to recognise that we can learn from Aboriginal societies and the importance they place on relationships, on ceremony, on connections, on being, on just surviving.
I thought of this exhibition came together piece by piece, in a sense. It wasn't, we had an idea of doing this, and the idea of art, as I said, is a social act, and I still believe it's what it should be. Art that isn't a social act isn't art. I gave a talk to a Melbourne Institute for Post-Colonial Studies recently, and I said I've been working in the arts for about 30 years, and I find now that racism is as prevalent, and it's become more casual and subtle and just accepted. It's casually done. No matter all the changes that have happened within the arts and the funding, etc., it's become just as racist as when I started. It's just a casual and insipid racism. I really think this is important to continue to do this type of exhibition, because it's this other way that you can bring the story, and it's a true way of how art can talk to you. Thanks.